In the spring of 1912, she was the largest moving object ever built by human hands. Nearly 900 feet of steel and ambition, rising 11 stories above the water. The Royal Mail ship Titanic was a floating palace, a triumph of the modern age. The newspapers called her a wonder. Some called her unsinkable. For the people who would sail on her, she represented something more, the future itself, gleaming and unstoppable. No one boarding her that April could have imagined that within days, her name would become the most famous tragedy in maritime history. Her story began not on the ocean, but in the shipyards of Belfast, Ireland. At Harland and Wolff, thousands of workers laboured for years to bring her to life. They raised a skeleton of steel taller than the buildings around it, and drove in more than 3 million rivets by hand. When Titanic was launched, it took 22 tons of soap and grease to slide her mighty hull into the water. She and her sister ship, Olympic, were the crowning achievement of the White Star Line. Inside, no expense was spared. There were grand staircases of polished oak, crystal chandeliers, a swimming pool, a gymnasium, even a squash court and a Turkish bath. First-class passengers would dine like royalty. To step aboard Titanic was to step into a world of impossible luxury, a symbol of an age that believed technology had conquered nature itself. She was, in every sense, a marvel, and she was about to make her very first voyage. On the 10th of April, 1912, Titanic set out from Southampton, England, on her maiden voyage to New York. More than 2,200 souls were aboard. Among them were some of the richest people in the world, the millionaire John Jacob Astor and his young wife, the mining heir Benjamin Guggenheim, the owner of Macy's, Isidor Straus, traveling with his beloved wife Ida. But most of those aboard were not wealthy at all. Deep below decks rode hundreds of third-class passengers, immigrants from Ireland, from Scandinavia, from across Europe, carrying everything they owned, chasing a new life in America. In command stood Captain Edward John Smith, the White Star Line's most experienced officer, a calm, white-bearded veteran of the sea. This was to be his final voyage before retirement, the crowning glory of a long and celebrated career. As Titanic pulled away from the dock, a crowd cheered. The great ship gathered speed and turned her bow toward the open Atlantic. For 4 days, Titanic was a dream afloat. Passengers strolled her decks in the crisp sea air. In the first-class dining saloon, an orchestra played as diners in evening dress laughed over champagne. Children raced along the promenade. In steerage, families sang songs in a dozen languages. The ship's wireless operators tapped out cheerful messages from passengers to their loved ones on shore. Everything ran with clockwork precision. The Atlantic was unusually calm, the water like glass. But out ahead in the black water of the North Atlantic, the sea was hiding something. Other ships had begun sending warnings by wireless, ice, fields of it drifting south into the shipping lanes. One after another, the messages came in, and one after another, as Titanic raced westward at nearly full speed, they went unheeded. Sunday, the 14th of April. The temperature had fallen sharply. The sea was flat and moonless, the sky a blaze of stars. High in the crow's nest, 2 lookouts strained their eyes into the darkness. They had no binoculars. At 20 minutes to midnight, the lookout Frederick Fleet saw it, a towering black shape rising out of the night, directly in the ship's path. He rang the bell 3 times and telephoned the bridge with 4 words that would echo through history. Iceberg right ahead. The officers threw the engines into reverse and turned hard. For 37 agonizing seconds, Titanic swung. Almost she cleared it. But the Iceberg scraped along her starboard side beneath the waterline, and in that brush, quiet and almost gentle, it buckled her steel plates and opened her hull to the sea. Most passengers felt only a faint shudder. Some slept through it entirely. On deck, chunks of ice skittered across the boards, and a few passengers laughingly kicked them about. No one yet understood. The unsinkable ship had been mortally wounded. Captain Smith summoned the ship's builder, Thomas Andrews, who had travelled aboard to watch over his creation. Together, they went below, and what Andrews saw drained the colour from his face. 5 of the ship's watertight compartments were flooding. Titanic could stay afloat with 4 compartments breached, but not 5. The water would spill over the tops of the bulkheads, one into the next, like water filling an ice cube tray, and drag her down by the bow. Andrews did the arithmetic in his head and delivered the unthinkable verdict. Titanic would sink. She had perhaps an hour, maybe 2. And then came the second horror. Titanic carried lifeboats for barely half the people aboard. Only 20 boats, enough for around 1,100, on a ship carrying more than 2,200. The boats had been thought of as clutter on so grand and safe a vessel. Now that arithmetic meant something terrible. There were not enough places in the boats. That night, more than 1,000 people would have nowhere to go. At 25 minutes past midnight, Captain Smith gave the order: uncover the boats and load women and children first. The band was told to play, to keep spirits calm, and play they did, out on the open deck in the freezing air. Down in the wireless room, the operators hammered out the distress call and then the newer signal, SOS. Somewhere out in the dark, the lights of another ship glimmered on the horizon, close enough to see, too far or too silent to help. Rockets went up, bursting white over the water. As the crew began loading the boats, confusion reigned. Many passengers refused to leave the warm, brightly lit ship for a small wooden boat and the black ocean below. The first lifeboats were lowered half empty. One boat built for 65 people left, with only 28. Slowly, as the deck began to tilt underfoot, the truth set in. Husbands kissed their wives and children goodbye and stepped back, helping them into the boats and staying behind. Acts of unbearable courage and unbearable heartbreak played out all across the deck. But there is a haunting question that lingers over that night. For only a few miles away, close enough to see Titanic's lights, sat another ship. The Californian had stopped for the night, hemmed in by the very ice field Titanic had been warned about. Her lone wireless operator had gone to bed. Through the darkness, her crew watched a nearby steamer fire rocket after rocket into the sky, 8 in all, white and bright. But they could not make sense of the signals, and no one woke the wireless man. They watched, and they did nothing. Had the Californian answered, had she pushed through the ice, she might have reached Titanic in time to save hundreds, perhaps everyone aboard. Instead, she sat in silence, a few miles and a lifetime away, while the greatest rescue that never happened played out on the horizon. To this day, the Californian remains one of the most painful what-ifs in all of maritime history. While the world remembers the passengers, another quiet heroism was unfolding far below the decks. Deep in the belly of the ship, the engineers and stokers stayed at their posts to the very end, feeding the boilers and working the pumps, keeping the electric lights burning and the wireless alive, so that others might have a chance. Not one of the engineers survived. In the wireless room, the young operator Jack Phillips tapped out distress calls until the power finally failed and the sea was at the door. The ship's postal clerk struggled to drag the mail to higher ground as the water rose around them. And on the sloping deck, the band played on. Their bandmaster, Wallace Hartley, and all 7 of his musicians perished, having chosen to spend their final moments bringing a measure of calm to the terrified. They were not required to stay. They stayed anyway. And in doing so, they turned a catastrophe into something the world would forever remember as grace under fire. Some chose to meet the end on their own terms. Benjamin Guggenheim and his valet changed into their finest evening clothes and declared they were prepared to go down like gentlemen. The elderly Isidor Strauss would not take a seat while women still waited. His wife Ida refused to leave him, and the couple, married 40 years, sat together on the deck to face the end side by side. Thomas Andrews, the man who built her, was last seen staring at a painting in the smoking room. As the bows sank lower, the sea climbed the decks. The lights still burned. The band, legend says, played on, and their final hymn drifted out across the water. By 2 o'clock in the morning, the stern was rising into the sky, higher and higher, until the ship stood nearly upright against the stars. Then, with a roar of breaking machinery, Titanic tore in two. The lights flickered and went out. And at 20 minutes past 2, on the 15th of April, 1912, the greatest ship in the world slipped beneath the surface of the Atlantic and was gone, taking more than 1,500 people with her into the dark. What followed was, to many survivors, the most haunting memory of all. Hundreds of people were now in the water, wearing their lifebelts in a sea so cold it could steal the life from a body in minutes. From the darkness rose a sound the survivors would never forget, the desperate crying of hundreds of voices, calling for help across the black water. In the lifeboats only yards away, people sat frozen, many terrified that if they rowed back, the drowning would swamp and capsize them. Only a few boats returned. By the time they did, the crying had faded to silence. Of the more than 2,200 people who had sailed on Titanic, only around 700 survived. The rest were lost to the North Atlantic. The calm, star-filled night that had seemed so beautiful had become a graveyard. Nearly 60 miles away, another ship had heard the call. The Carpathia turned about and raced through the same ice-strewn waters at reckless speed, her captain risking his own ship to reach the dying. She arrived as dawn broke over an ocean scattered with wreckage and lifeboats. One by one, the survivors were lifted aboard, frozen, silent, many of them now widows and orphans. As Carpathia carried them toward New York, the world's newspapers erupted with the impossible news. The unsinkable Titanic had sunk on her maiden voyage. When the ship reached New York Harbor, tens of thousands stood waiting in the rain, in a silence broken only by weeping, as the survivors came down the gangway into a world that would never quite believe it had happened. The loss of Titanic sent a shock through the world that has never fully faded. The inquiries that followed asked how such a thing could happen, and their answers changed the sea forever. New laws demanded enough lifeboats for every single soul aboard. Ships were required to keep their wireless manned around the clock. An international ice patrol was created to watch the North Atlantic, and it watches still, more than a century later. For over 70 years, Titanic lay lost, somewhere in the crushing black depths. Then, in 1985, an expedition led by Robert Ballard found her at last, resting 2.5 miles down, broken, but strangely peaceful, slowly being reclaimed by the sea. She remains there today, a silent memorial to the 1,500 who never came home. Titanic was called unsinkable. Her true legacy is a humbler and more human lesson, that no matter how great our machines, the sea and time will humble us all. And that, in our darkest hour, ordinary people are capable of extraordinary courage.